A Roman gladiator walked into a latrine, picked up a communal sponge on a stick, and shoved it down his own throat. He died choking on a tool that hundreds of strangers had used to wipe themselves. Seneca the Younger recorded the event around 65 CE, describing a Germanic fighter who suffocated himself with a tersorium rather than face the arena. The object that killed him was not a weapon. It was the ancient world's most common toilet paper. But to understand how a sponge stick became a suicide tool, you need to see what daily hygiene looked like 2,000 years before the perforated roll. In 424 BCE, the Athenian playwright Aristophanes staged a comedy called The Knights. The play was a vicious political satire aimed at a powerful general named Cleon. But buried in the crude jokes was a detail that historians now treasure. Aristophanes referenced something called a pessoi. A pessos was a small, smooth, rounded piece of ceramic or broken pottery. Greeks used them for anal cleansing in both private homes and public latrines. The word itself came from the Greek term for a game piece, like a pebble used in a board game. You cleaned yourself with a stone, then discarded it or rinsed it for reuse. Archaeologists excavating ancient Greek latrines found piles of ostraca, broken pottery shards, exactly where the waste channels once ran. Some of those shards even bore the names of prominent Athenians scratched into the surface. The practice carried a dark layer of political symbolism. In Athens, ostraca were also used for ostracism votes, the mechanism by which citizens could exile a public figure for 10 years. You wrote the name of the man you wanted banished on a pottery shard and dropped it into the voting urn. The same material that expelled a politician from the city could end up wiping his political rivals. Scholars have found pottery fragments in latrine pits with names like Themistocles and Cimon etched into them. The message was unmistakable. You were not just cleaning yourself with a rock. You were symbolically smearing your enemy's name with excrement. The practice existed centuries before Aristophanes put it on stage. Cretan palace latrines dating to the Minoan period show evidence of stone-based cleansing as far back as 2000 BCE. By the classical era, pessoi were the standard across the Greek mainland and its colonies. But the Greeks were not alone in their stone-wiping habits. Archaeological evidence from the Middle East and North Africa shows that smoothed stones and pottery fragments served the same purpose in cultures spanning the Mediterranean basin. The fundamental problem was universal. Human waste needed to be cleaned from the body, and paper did not exist. So people used what was abundant, hard, and portable, stone. And then came Rome. The Romans looked at the Greek system of individually owned wiping stones and said, "We can do better." They could not. What they built instead was a public health nightmare that killed at least one man and sickened countless others. Roman public latrines were marvels of engineering. The city of Rome alone contained an estimated 144 public facilities by the late imperial period. These were long rectangular rooms lined with marble or wooden benches. Beneath each seat opening, a channel of running water carried waste into the great sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima. A smaller channel of fresh water ran in a trough along the floor directly in front of the user's feet. The design was sophisticated. The toilet technology of the Eternal City was genuinely centuries ahead of its time. Except for one catastrophic detail: the wiping tool. In a Greek latrine, you brought your own pessoi, or used a discarded shard left by someone else. In a Roman latrine, you reached for the tersorium. The tersorium was a sea sponge lashed to the end of a short wooden stick. It sat in a bucket of salt water or vinegar positioned in the center of the latrine. You used it. You rinsed it in the bucket. You put it back. And the next person sitting on the bench picked up the same sponge and the same stick and brought it toward their own body. There was no private tersorium. There was no cleaning between uses beyond a quick dip in liquid that grew steadily more contaminated as the day wore on and dozens of hands reached into the same bucket. The Romans understood water engineering at a level that would not be matched in Europe for another 1,400 years. They built aqueducts that delivered millions of gallons of fresh water to their cities each day. They knew how to move it, heat it, and channel it away. They understood that filth was linked to illness on some intuitive level, even without germ theory. But in the latrine itself, Their solution for the most intimate act of cleaning was a shared sponge that never truly got clean. The medical consequences were undocumented, but mathematically certain. Every Roman who used a public latrine exposed themselves to whatever bacteria the previous dozen users had deposited into that sponge and that bucket. Intestinal parasites, dysentery, and fecal-borne infections moved through the population along routes that the aqueducts could not wash away. The tersorium was a disease vector disguised as a convenience. It was not just unsanitary, it was dangerous in ways no Roman physician could have explained. And it was also lethal in a way nobody anticipated. Around 65 CE, Seneca the Younger, the Stoic philosopher and tutor to Emperor Nero, wrote a letter cataloging the deaths of various Germanic gladiators. He was interested in how men faced death. One account stood out. A fighter from Germania, brought to Rome and trained for the arena, looked at the life ahead of him and chose to end it. He was not granted a private death. He died in a latrine, surrounded by the smell of waste and the noise of the city. And the tool he used was the only one available. Seneca recorded that the man grabbed the sponge attached to the stick, the communal tersorium, and forced it deep into his throat. He suffocated. Roman latrines had no stall doors and no privacy partitions. He would have died in full view of anyone else sitting on the stone benches. Seneca's point was philosophical. He admired the man's resolve to escape slavery and spectacle through sheer force of will. He described the death as noble in its desperation. But the detail that resonates across 2,000 years is the object itself. A sponge on a stick, sitting in a bucket, handled by hands that had just touched every surface of the latrine, pushed down a man's windpipe until he could not breathe. The tersorium was common enough in the 1st century that Seneca did not need to explain what it was to his readers. Everyone in the Roman world knew the sponge stick. Everyone had used one. His account told the story of a suicide, but it also accidentally preserved the single most visceral detail of ancient Roman sanitation. The tool you trusted to clean your body was also a tool someone used to die. And with that, the story of ancient toilet paper hit its first documented horror story. Half a world away, a completely different solution was taking shape that would one day replace both the stone and the sponge. In 6th century China, a scholar named Yan Zhitui set down a set of instructions for his clan. Yan served the Northern Qi dynasty, a short-lived kingdom during the chaotic period of the Northern and Southern dynasties. He was a writer, a calligrapher, and a man who cared deeply about the proper treatment of sacred texts. In his work, Family Instructions for the Yan Clan, written around 580 CE, he included a line that historians now recognize as the earliest surviving reference to paper used for toilet purposes. Yan wrote that he dared not use paper containing quotations from the 5 classics or the names of sages for toilet purposes. The sentence was a warning about respecting knowledge, but the implication was staggering. If Yan had to tell his family not to use certain types of paper in the latrine, the practice was already widespread. People in 6th century China were wiping themselves with paper 1,300 years before the first American roll was ever packaged. Chinese papermaking had been invented centuries earlier, traditionally dated to 105 CE, under the Han Dynasty court official Cai Lun. By Yan Zhitui's time, paper was abundant enough in literate households that it could be casually used and discarded in the latrine. The paper Yan referenced was not soft quilted toilet tissue. It was writing paper, rough and fibrous, but it was paper nonetheless. The Chinese had solved the problem that the Greeks handled with stones and the Romans handled with sponges by using a lightweight, disposable material that carried waste away and did not need to be shared. It was the first step toward the modern solution. Yet the rest of the world did not follow. Chinese papermaking technology spread slowly along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century and Europe by the 12th. But the use of paper as a wiping material remained a regional practice for centuries. Europeans did not adopt it. Neither did the civilizations of the Middle East or South Asia, which had their own deeply embedded systems. Yan Zhitui's delicate warning about sacred texts was the only written record of paper-based hygiene for more than 700 years. And when the next great wave of toilet innovation arrived, It would not come from a scholar or an engineer. It would come from a medieval king who needed someone to handle his cloths. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE, the tersorium vanished from European latrines. The aqueducts fell into disrepair, and the communal bathhouses emptied. No centralized authority remained to maintain the vinegar buckets or replace the sea sponges. What replaced the sponge stick was not a single solution, but a fractured map of local improvisation. In northern Europe, where forests stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, the most common material was moss. Sphagnum moss grew abundantly in the damp woodlands of Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the Germanic territories. It was soft, absorbent, and naturally antimicrobial, though no medieval peasant understood the chemistry behind that property. A handful of fresh moss did the job that a tersorium once performed and required no rinsing afterward. It was single-use by default, discarded into a pit or tossed into the undergrowth. In regions where moss was scarce, broad leaves served the same purpose. Mullein leaves, with their thick and velvety texture, were prized across rural England and France. The plant grew tall and common in disturbed soil, along roadsides and field edges. Its leaves were large enough to grip and soft enough to avoid irritation. Other plants filled the same role depending on the season and the latitude. Lamb's ear, with its downy surface, appeared in folk remedies for skin ailments and doubled as a wiping material. Comfrey leaves, dock leaves, and even handfuls of hay served when nothing better was available. The hierarchy of plant materials was intuitive and universal. Soft and broad ranked above brittle and narrow. Dry ranked above wet. What grew nearest the latrine ranked above what required a walk. Across the Atlantic, in the lands that would become colonial America, a completely different plant provided the standard solution. Maize, the staple crop of indigenous agriculture, produced a cob that was tough, fibrous, and abundant. After the kernels were stripped for meal or feed, the bare cob remained. It was roughly the length of a human hand and textured enough to scrape clean. Colonial settlers adopted the corn cob from native populations who had used it for generations. By the 1600s, the corn cob was the default wiping tool in outhouses from Massachusetts to Virginia. A cob could be used once and thrown down the pit, or reused after a rinse if water was handy. The material was so common that no one bothered to document it in letters or diaries for the first century of colonial life. It was not remarkable enough to record. It was simply what sat in the corner of every outhouse next to the wooden bench. Archaeologists excavating colonial latrine pits in the 20th century confirmed what the written record barely mentioned. They found layers of corn cobs preserved in anaerobic soil, stripped of their kernels and stained dark with age. The cob was the American pessoy, a humble object that served a vital function and left almost no trace in polite literature. In the Arctic, where neither corn nor broadleaves nor moss grew in reliable quantities, the Inuit used what the environment provided. Snow was abundant and malleable. A packed handful of snow could be shaped into a rounded scraper and used once before it melted away. The cold numbed the skin, which made the process less pleasant than it sounds. But snow was sterile and left no residue. It was a functional solution in an environment that offered few alternatives. Along the coastlines of Hawaii and other Pacific islands, the material of choice was the seashell. Polished by waves and available in every size, shells served as natural scrapers. A smooth cowrie shell or a flat piece of broken coral could be rinsed in seawater and reused indefinitely. The practice persisted well into the contact period, when European sailors observed it and recorded their observations in ships' logs. What united all these materials, from moss to corncob to snow to shell, was that they were free and they were disposable. The poor across the world wiped with whatever the land provided and never paid a coin for the privilege. The wealthy operated under an entirely different logic. In medieval European courts, linen cloth was the marker of status in the latrine as much as in the wardrobe. A lord or a bishop did not scrape with a cob or a leaf. He used soft, washed rags, often cut from old undergarments or table linens that had been retired from formal use. These cloths were not thrown away. They were collected by servants, boiled in large kettles, and returned to the privy chamber for reuse. The process was labor-intensive and required a staff large enough to handle the laundry. That labor cost was the invisible barrier that kept linen wiping exclusive to the upper class. A peasant family could not spare the fuel to boil water for soiled rags when every log had to heat the keeping room. A noble household could. The distinction was not about cleanliness as a moral virtue. It was about the sheer logistics of available labor. Nowhere was that distinction more formalized than in the Tudor court of 16th-century England. King Henry VIII, who ruled from 1509 to 1547, maintained a household of roughly 1,000 attendants. Among those attendants was a single man whose title placed him in intimate proximity to the monarch's body. He was called the Groom of the Stool. The position was not a punishment or a joke. It was one of the highest honors a courtier could receive. The Groom of the Stool was responsible for attending the king during his visits to the close stool, the private portable toilet used by the monarch. He carried the supplies. He assisted with the king's clothing. He handled the linen cloths. And because he was alone with the king in a room where no one else was admitted, he became a trusted confidant. The groom heard the king's private thoughts, his complaints, his schemes, his fears. Courtiers who wanted influence over royal policy sought the groom's favor because the groom had the king's ear in a way no minister ever could. Under Henry VIII, the role was held by a succession of gentlemen, including Sir William Compton and Sir Henry Norris. Both men wielded significant political power. Norris was executed in 1536 during the purge that accompanied Anne Boleyn's downfall, a sign of how close the groom stood to the dangerous currents of court politics. The position continued under subsequent Tudor monarchs. Queen Elizabeth I, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, had her own Groom of the Stool, a title later adjusted to Lady of the Bedchamber as the role evolved. The linen cloths these attendants managed were not the rough rags of a peasant household. They were fine, soft fabric, often wool or linen, that had been washed and bleached and dried. The experience of the Tudor monarch in the Privy Chamber was as far removed from the experience of a London laborer as the palace was from a hovel. The monarch wiped with fabric that had passed through the hands of a titled official. The laborer wiped with a fistful of grass pulled from the roadside. That gap was not hidden or secret. It was the visible architecture of a society built on rigid hierarchy. While Europe experimented with moss and rags and corncobs, a completely different system governed hygiene across the Islamic world, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. In these regions, the dominant method did not rely on solid materials at all. It relied on water and the left hand. The practice was rooted in religious and cultural codes that predated the medieval period by centuries. Islamic ritual purity laws, derived from the Quran and the Hadith, prescribed washing with water after defecation. The left hand was designated for this task. The right hand was reserved for eating, greeting, and handling clean objects. The division was strict and socially enforced across the entire Islamic world, from Al-Andalus in the west to the sultanates of Southeast Asia in the east. A person who ate with their left hand committed a serious breach of etiquette. The water used for cleansing was carried in a small vessel called a lota, or bodna, kept near the latrine or carried to it. The user poured water with the right hand and cleaned with the left. In urban centers, public latrines often featured channels of running water or cisterns maintained by the Waqf, the charitable endowment system. Private homes had earthenware pots or copper vessels reserved for the purpose. The system was hygienic by the standards of the pre-germ theory world because water carried waste away from the body more thoroughly than any dry material. The evidence for this practice comes not from Islamic sources alone, but from the accounts of travelers who crossed into these regions and found the customs unfamiliar. The most famous of those travelers was Ibn Battuta. Born in Tangier, Morocco in 1304, Ibn Battuta set out at age 21 on a pilgrimage to Mecca and did not return home for nearly 30 years. He traveled across North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and China. He covered more than 75,000 miles and dictated his experiences in a travelogue known as the Rihla. In his writings, Ibn Battuta frequently noted the latrine arrangements of the places he visited. He observed that in the Maldives, the inhabitants used coconut shells to scoop water for cleansing. In the courts of Delhi, he recorded that the Sultan's latrines were equipped with vessels of brass and running water channels. He noted that the Chinese, whom he visited in the 1340s, were less fastidious than Muslims in their use of water and relied more heavily on paper. But the Chinese paper he observed was not the rough writing paper that Yan Zhitui had warned about 800 years earlier. By the 14th century, Chinese papermakers were producing a specific type of soft, thick paper for toilet use. Ibn Battuta described it with the precision of a man who had spent his life comparing the customs of different lands. He wrote that the Chinese, after relieving themselves, cleaned themselves with paper and then washed with water, combining the two methods. He did not express disgust or surprise. He simply recorded the fact as one more variation in the vast tapestry of human practice. The left-hand method remained opaque to Europeans well into the age of exploration. When Portuguese traders and Dutch merchants arrived in India and the East Indies in the 16th and 17th centuries, they encountered the practice without understanding its rationale. European accounts from this period frequently described the left-hand custom with a mixture of confusion and condescension. The traders did not recognize that a water-based system was, in terms of actual cleanliness, superior to their own dry scraping methods. They saw only a foreign practice that violated their own unspoken rules about which hand was clean. The misunderstanding ran in both directions. Visitors from the Islamic world who traveled to Europe during the medieval and early modern periods were often appalled by European latrine habits. They observed that Europeans used solid materials to wipe and did not wash with water afterward. A 10th-century Arab traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who journeyed to the Volga River region, described the Rus Vikings as filthy in their habits because they did not wash after relieving themselves. The judgment was mutual, and it was absolute. Each civilization looked at the other's hygiene practices and saw barbarism. Neither recognized that its own system was simply a set of behaviors shaped by available materials, religious codes, and inherited tradition. By the 1700s, the global map of toilet hygiene had stabilized into broad regional patterns. Northern Europe and its American colonies relied on plant materials, with the corncob dominating in North America. The Mediterranean world, long past the fall of Rome, used whatever was cheap and local. The Islamic world, South Asia, and Southeast Asia used water and the left hand. East Asia used paper. The wealthy in every region used softer, cleaner, and more labor-intensive versions of whatever their culture produced. The poor used whatever cost nothing, and that map held steady for another 100 years. No one improved the corncob because the corncob worked. No one replaced the left hand because the left hand was mandated by faith and custom. The moss and the leaf and the shell and the snow persisted not because anyone thought they were ideal, but because the alternative, a mass-produced, affordable, disposable material, did not exist yet. The Chinese had paper, but it remained a regional product. The Europeans had linen, but it was a luxury. The world was waiting for a material breakthrough that would standardize an act that had been improvised for 5,000 years. But the breakthrough, when it came, would not arrive in the form of a new fiber or a new technology. It would arrive first as a catalog, printed in Chicago and shipped by rail to every farmhouse in America. And before that catalog became a roll sitting in every bathroom, the story would pass through a New York inventor who soaked sheets of paper in aloe and sold them as medicine. In 1857, a New York inventor named Joseph Gaiety introduced the first commercially packaged toilet paper in American history. His product was not a roll. It was a flat stack of individual sheets, each one watermarked with his name, and it was sold as medicine. Gaiety's medicated paper for the water closet arrived in a pink wrapper with the promise that it would cure hemorrhoids and prevent irritation. The sheets were soaked in aloe and lubricated with a thin coating of the plant's gel. Gaiety was not a physician. He was a businessman who had identified a gap in the market and filled it with a product that solved a problem most people were too embarrassed to discuss. His advertising copy was explicit about the dangers of using ordinary paper. The cheap newsprint and catalog pages that Americans had begun using in their outhouses were, according to Gaiety, coated in chemicals that inflamed sensitive tissue. His paper, by contrast, was pure, medicated, and safe. Each package contained 500 sheets and sold for 50 cents. Gaiety printed his name on every single sheet. He did this not out of vanity, but because he understood that his product would sit in outhouses across the country, and he wanted every user to remember who had provided the relief. The branding was aggressive by the standards of the era, but Gaiety faced a larger problem than name recognition. American consumers in the 1850s had no precedent for paying money for something they had always obtained for free. The corncob cost nothing. The moss behind the barn cost nothing. The torn squares of old newspaper cost nothing. Convincing a farmer or a shopkeeper to spend half a dollar on medicated sheets of paper required Gaiety to reframe the entire act of wiping as a health concern, not a convenience. His advertisements described ordinary wiping materials as dangerous irritants that caused piles, inflammation, and chronic discomfort. The solution, he insisted, was his paper. The product launched in New York and found modest success among the wealthy and the health-conscious. Gaiety's paper was stocked in drugstores, not general stores, which positioned it alongside tonics, liniments, and other patent medicines of the period. But the market was limited. The United States in 1857 was a country where the majority of the population still lived on farms and used outhouses that were little more than wooden boxes over a pit. Indoor plumbing was a luxury confined to the largest cities. The idea that a family would purchase a specialized paper product to use once and then discard into a hole in the ground struck most Americans as absurd. Gaiety's paper sold poorly. The company folded within a few years. The product itself, however, was ahead of its time. The aloe-treated sheets were genuinely softer and less irritating than the alternatives. The concept of a single-use, commercially packaged wiping material was sound. What Gaiety had failed to do was make it cheap enough, available enough, and culturally normal enough for a mass audience. That would require a different kind of distribution system and a different kind of paper. The paper that ended up in millions of American outhouses over the next 4 decades did not arrive wrapped in pink packaging with medicinal claims. It arrived as a free catalog, shipped by rail, and it was called Sears. In 1886, a railroad station agent in North Redwood, Minnesota, named Richard Warren Sears, began selling watches by mail order. His catalog business grew rapidly. By 1894, the Sears, Roebuck & Company catalog had swelled to more than 500 pages of merchandise, from furniture to firearms to farm equipment. The catalog was printed on cheap, absorbent, uncoated paper. It was delivered to rural households across the United States at no charge, and it arrived in outhouses by the tens of thousands within weeks of arriving in the mailbox. The practice was universal and unspoken. Farm families in Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and the Dakotas hung the catalog on a nail inside the outhouse door. Pages were torn out, crumpled to soften the fibers, and used once before dropping into the pit. The ink occasionally stained the skin, but the paper was free, plentiful, and replaced twice a year when the new catalog arrived. The Sears catalog became, without any intention from the company, the most widely used toilet paper in rural America during the final decade of the 19th century. No one at Sears, Roebuck & Company had designed the catalog for this purpose. The paper was selected to keep printing costs low, not to provide comfort. But the sheer volume of the catalogs, their guaranteed twice-yearly delivery, and their presence in millions of homes made them the default. Rural Americans who had used corncobs and leaves a generation earlier were now using mass-produced paper. The transition happened without a public campaign, without advertising, and without a single patent. It happened because a mail-order business had saturated the countryside with cheap paper at the exact moment that standards of domestic cleanliness were beginning to shift. The shift itself was driven by new ideas about hygiene, disease, and the invisible dangers of waste. In 1854, a London physician named John Snow had traced a cholera outbreak to a contaminated water pump, demonstrating that disease traveled through water, not air. In the 1860s, Louis Pasteur established germ theory, proving that microorganisms caused infection. By the 1880s, Robert Koch had identified the specific bacteria responsible for cholera and tuberculosis. The scientific understanding of how disease spread through fecal contamination transformed public health policy in cities across the Western world. Sanitary reformers pushed for modern sewer systems, clean water supplies, and indoor plumbing. Cities that had once tolerated open privies and communal latrines began to invest in infrastructure that separated human waste from drinking water. The outhouse, which had been a fixture of American life for 2 centuries, was slowly being replaced by the water closet. And the water closet required a material that could be flushed without clogging the pipes. The corncob could not be flushed. The moss and the leaf and the rag could not be flushed. The smooth stones and broken pottery of the ancient world could not be flushed. Paper could. The transition from the outhouse pit to the porcelain bowl created a technical requirement that had never existed before. Wiping materials had to be soft enough to use, strong enough to hold together, and thin enough to dissolve in water without blocking the drain. Gayety's medicated sheets met the first 2 requirements, but not the third. His paper was too thick. The Sears catalog paper was thin enough, but not designed for dissolution. Something new was needed. The inventor who solved the problem did not set out to create a bathroom product. He set out to improve the cutting and dispensing of rolled wrapping paper. On July 7, 1891, Seth Wheeler of Albany, New York, received United States Patent number 455,327 for an invention he called the wrapping and toilet paper roll. The patent described a continuous roll of paper divided into individual sheets by a line of perforations. Wheeler's innovation was not the roll itself. Rolled paper already existed for wrapping parcels and for use in printing presses. His innovation was the perforation, a line of tiny cuts that allowed each sheet to separate cleanly from the roll with a single pull. The patent drawings are exact and detailed. They show a roll mounted on a horizontal spindle inside a dispensing bracket. The paper feeds over the top of the roll. The sheets tear away along the perforated line. The bracket holds the roll steady so that a user can pull one sheet free without the entire roll unwinding. Wheeler's patent drawing is, in every functional detail, the modern toilet paper dispenser. He understood that his invention would be used in bathrooms. The patent application explicitly referenced the product as toilet paper. But Wheeler was not the first to sell rolled toilet paper. The British Perforated Paper Company had marketed rolled toilet paper in the United Kingdom as early as 1880, using a formula of hemp and aloe that was softer than newsprint. The Scott Paper Company, founded by brothers E. Irvin and Clarence Scott in Philadelphia in 1879, had begun selling rolls of toilet paper to hotels and drugstores by 1890. Scott's product was unperforated. The user had to tear or cut the paper from the roll by hand. Wheeler's perforation patent changed the economics of the industry. With perforations, each sheet was a unit. The user pulled one sheet and it separated cleanly. That simple mechanical act made it possible to standardize consumption. A roll of 500 sheets would, on average, last a predictable number of days. Manufacturers could package rolls by sheet count, and consumers could compare prices across brands. The perforation did for toilet paper what the standardized railroad gauge did for railways. It made the product interchangeable. The Albany Perforated Wrapping Paper Company, which Wheeler co-owned, began producing perforated toilet paper in the early 1890s. Other manufacturers followed. The Scott Paper Company adopted the perforated roll and, by the early 20th century, had become the dominant American brand. Toilet paper was now a commodity, manufactured by the mile, sliced into sheets, rolled onto cardboard tubes, and wrapped in paper that hid its function from public view. The wrapping was deliberate. Even as toilet paper became a standard household product, the word itself remained unspeakable in polite company. Advertisements referred to bathroom tissue or toilet tissue. The packaging avoided direct references to bodily functions. The product was sold alongside soap and towels, positioned as a hygiene item rather than a wiping tool. The embarrassment that had made Gayety's advertising copy so explicit in 1857 had, by 1900, driven the industry in the opposite direction. Toilet paper was everywhere and discussed nowhere. The social disparity that had marked every previous era of hygiene remained intact. Wealthy households in cities with indoor plumbing purchased soft, white, commercially packaged toilet paper by the case. Poor households in tenement apartments used squares of old newspaper or continued to rely on shared privies where paper of any kind was scarce. Rural families who had not yet installed indoor plumbing used the Sears catalog, the Montgomery Ward catalog, or any other free printed material that came through the mail. The gap between rich and poor was not merely a matter of comfort. It was a matter of health. The link between disposable wiping materials and reduced disease transmission was becoming clear to public health officials. Shared, reusable cloths, like the Roman Tersorium or the Tudor linen, had always carried the risk of passing infection from one user to the next. The left-hand method, when paired with soap and clean water, was effective, but soap and clean water were themselves luxuries in much of the world. Single-use paper eliminated the shared surface. Each wipe was sterile, fresh, and discarded immediately after use. No one knew this in 1891. Germ theory was still young, and its implications for bathroom hygiene had not been fully absorbed by the public. But the disposable paper roll was, by accident of engineering, a public health intervention as much as a convenience. By 1900, the perforated roll was being manufactured in the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany. The product grew steadily throughout the early 20th century, driven by the spread of indoor plumbing and the rise of chain drugstores. By 1935, Northern Tissue was advertising its paper as splinter-free, a claim that reveals what earlier toilet papers had been like. The smooth, soft, multi-ply paper that fills supermarket aisles today would not arrive until the 1940s and 1950s. The early rolls were rough, brown, and utilitarian, but they were cheap. They were disposable, and they flushed. The perforated roll solved a technical problem that had existed since the first Mesopotamian city built its first sewer drain. It allowed human beings to clean themselves with something that carried away waste rather than collecting it. And it arrived not because a doctor prescribed it, not because a government mandated it, but because an inventor in Albany saw a way to cut paper so that it tore cleanly. The rest of the story happened afterward, in the bathrooms and outhouses of millions of homes, where the catalog page gave way to the roll, and the roll became so ordinary that no one thought about it anymore.